They laughed, not awkwardly, not accidentally. They laughed at her, at my adopted daughter, sitting right there, while pretending it was just a joke. That was the moment I stopped explaining, stopped correcting, and stood up. Because once people show you they're comfortable mocking a child, the conversation is already over. It didn't sound cruel at first. That's the part people miss. It sounded like teasing, like familiarity, like the kind of comment people excuse because it's wrapped in laughter. My family had always treated my daughter like an add-on, not openly hostile, just different. Questions asked with raised eyebrows, jokes that landed a little too close, comments framed as curiosity instead of judgment. I noticed them, I always did, and every time I explained. My name is Elena Brooks. I was 37, worked in logistics management, and had spent years telling myself that if I stayed calm, if I corrected things gently, if I gave people enough context, they'd eventually understand. She's adopted. She's sensitive. She doesn't need to hear that. I said it politely, repeatedly. They nodded, and then they kept going. The day it happened, we were all together. Nothing formal, just family sitting around, talking too loudly, laughing too easily. My daughter was telling a story. She'd been excited, careful with her words, looking around to make sure people were listening. That's when someone smirked. Then another laugh followed. And then the comment came. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't aggressive, it was delivered casually, like something everyone else was already thinking. Something about her real family. Something about how kids like that always turn out. Something framed as humor. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My daughter didn't cry. She just stopped talking. She looked down at her hands and folded them together, tight. The way children do when they're trying to disappear without making it obvious. And in that moment, something shifted in me. I realized this wasn't about ignorance, or phrasing, or needing more explanation. This was about comfort. They were comfortable mocking a child because they didn't believe they'd lose access for it. I didn't say anything right away. I watched. I listened. I waited to see if anyone would correct it. No one did. That's when I understood something with complete clarity. If I spoke now, it would turn into another discussion, another explanation, another round of, they didn't mean it like that. And my daughter would still be sitting there, learning what people are allowed to say about her. So instead of explaining, I stood up. And that decision, the decision not to correct them, was the moment everything changed. The room didn't notice right away. They were still laughing, still talking over one another, still comfortable. I picked up my daughter's jacket and held it out to her without saying a word. She looked confused at first, then she stood up. That's when the tone shifted. "Wait, where are you going?" someone asked, still smiling, like this was part of the joke. I didn't answer. I helped my daughter put her jacket on, zipped it slowly, carefully. The way you do when you're trying to communicate safety without making a scene. My mother laughed, uneasy now. "Oh, come on, it was just teasing." There it was, the first minimization. I met her eyes and said, calmly, "We're leaving." The word leaving seemed to land heavier than anything else. Because it wasn't emotional, it wasn't loud, it wasn't negotiable. Someone scoffed. "Wow, that escalated quickly." Another added, "You're being dramatic." And for the first time, I didn't push back. I didn't clarify intent. I didn't explain impact. I didn't try to translate why mocking a child, any child, wasn't harmless. I just took my daughter's hand and walked toward the door. Behind us, the justifications stacked up fast. "They didn't mean it like that." "She needs thicker skin." "You're projecting." Each sentence was said louder than the last, not to reach me, but to reassure themselves. Outside, my daughter finally spoke. Did I do something wrong? I stopped walking immediately. No, I said. You didn't. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced, because children don't measure truth by words. They measure it by what adults tolerate. Inside that house, mockery had been tolerated, and I realized something that made my chest go tight. If I stayed, even to argue, I'd be teaching her that staying was the price of belonging. My phone started buzzing before we even reached the car. Messages came in fast. You embarrassed everyone. You overreacted. You could have just talked it through. The familiar script. For years, that would have pulled me back in. I would have explained, clarified, smoothed things over, but sitting there with my daughter buckled beside me, staring straight ahead, I felt something different. Not anger, certainty. Explaining would only make this feel debatable. And this wasn't. That's when I understood the real consequence of walking away. It wasn't punishment, it was removal. And once access is gone, the people who relied on it start to panic. The messages didn't stop, they multiplied. At first, they were annoyed, then confused, then offended. Not because of what was said about my daughter, but because I'd removed myself without permission. My sister was the first to call. "You really didn't have to make it that big of a deal," she said. "She's not going to remember it." That sentence made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Because children always remember how adults made them feel, even when adults pretend they won't. I asked one question. Would you have laughed if they said it about your child? She didn't answer. She sighed instead. That's not the same. It was the oldest trick in the book. Different rules, different standards, same silence. By the next day, the narrative had shifted. I wasn't protecting my daughter anymore. I was dividing the family. I was too sensitive. I was making people uncomfortable. I was holding on to things. Funny how quickly cruelty disappears once it's called out, and how fast the person who refuses to tolerate it becomes the problem. My parents reached out together. That alone told me they were preparing for a conversation, not accountability. They said they wanted to clear the air. They said everyone felt bad. They said I'd misunderstood the tone. And then my father added the sentence that changed everything. "You can't shield her forever." That was it. Because what he meant was, you can't protect her if it costs us comfort. I didn't argue. I didn't explain why mockery isn't a lesson. I didn't outline the damage of comments that teach a child she's different in the worst way. I said one thing. I don't need to shield her from the world. I need to shield her from people who think this is acceptable. There was silence on the other end. After that, invitations stopped. Plans went quiet. Group chats went dead. They wanted the distance to feel like punishment, like leverage. But what they didn't understand was that the distance felt familiar. Because emotionally, I'd been alone in that room long before I stood up. My daughter started asking fewer questions. She laughed more easily again. She stopped checking faces before she spoke. And that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't walk away to teach my family a lesson. I walked away because staying would have taught my daughter the wrong one. The mockery had ended the moment we left the room, but the consequences were only just beginning. We didn't go back. Not the next week, not the next holiday. Not after the messages softened and the tone shifted, because the shift wasn't real. It was strategic. They eventually reached out again, not to apologize, not to acknowledge what had been said, but to suggest we were all being too rigid, that maybe things could go back to normal if everyone just stopped dwelling on it. That's when I knew I'd made the right choice. Because normal had required my daughter to absorb disrespect quietly, and required me to smooth it over afterward. My daughter never asked why we stopped seeing them. She didn't need to. What she noticed instead was what changed. She spoke freely again. She laughed without checking the room. She stopped shrinking her voice mid-sentence. That told me more than any explanation ever could. I used to think walking away meant giving up. Now I understand it differently. Walking away was the first time I chose clarity over comfort, safety over access, my child over their approval. They still believe I overreacted. They still frame it as a misunderstanding. They still think one conversation could have fixed it. But that's the thing. When someone mocks a child, especially a child who already knows what it feels like to be different, the issue isn't wording. It's values. I didn't walk away to punish anyone. I walked away because explaining myself would have turned cruelty into a debate. And my daughter doesn't need to learn that her dignity is negotiable. My family mocked my adopted daughter. They thought it would pass. They thought I'd explain it away. They thought I'd stay. Instead, I stood up. I took her hand, and I walked away. Not angrily, not loudly, not dramatically. Just finally. And that was the moment I stopped explaining myself for good.